heaven and hell. It is from the Lord's divine human that heaven as a whole and in part resembles a man. 78. That it is from the Lord's divine human that heaven as a whole and in part resembles a man, follows as a conclusion from all that has been stated and shown in the preceding sections. For in them it has been shown, 1. That the Lord is the God of heaven. 2. That it is the divine of the Lord that makes heaven. 3. That heaven consists of innumerable societies, and that any one society is a heaven in lesser form, and each angel in the least form. 4. That the entire heaven, as one whole, resembles one man. 5. That each society in the heavens also resembles one man. 6. That therefore each angel is in a complete human form. All this leads to the conclusion that the divine, because it makes heaven, is human in form. That this divine is the divine human of the Lord can be seen still more clearly, because in a compendium, from passages from Arcana Caeles I8 which have been brought together and added as a corollary to this section, that the Lord's human is divine, and that it is not true that his human is not divine as is believed within the Church, may be seen from the same extracts, and also from the doctrine of the Holy Jerusalem towards the end, where it treats of the Lord. This refers to the work, the New Jerusalem and its heavenly doctrine. 79. That this is true has been proved to me by much experience, about which something will now be said. All the angels who are in the heavens never perceive the divine in any other than a human form, and what is wonderful, those in the higher heavens are unable to think of the divine in any other way. The necessity of their thinking in this way comes from the divine itself which inflows, and also from the form of heaven in accordance with which their thoughts extend around. For every thought that an angel has is extended into heaven, and he has intelligence and wisdom in accordance with that extension. It is in consequence of this that all in heaven acknowledge the Lord, because there is no divine human except in him. Not only have I been told all this by angels, but when elevated into the inner sphere of heaven, I have been enabled also to perceive it. From this it is evident that the wiser the angels are, the more clearly do they perceive this truth, and it is as a result of this that the Lord appears to them. For the Lord appears in a divine angelic form which is human to those who acknowledge and believe in a visible divine, but not to those who believe in an invisible one. For the former can see their divine, but the latter cannot see theirs. 83. For this reason, he who has no idea of heaven, that is, no idea of the divine from whom heaven exists, cannot be raised to the first threshold of heaven. As soon as he comes to it, the resistance and a strong repulsion is perceived. This is because in his case the interiors which should have been receptive of heaven, have been closed on account of their not being in the form of heaven. Indeed, the nearer he comes to heaven, the more tightly are his interiors closed up. Such is the lot of those within the Church who deny the Lord, and of those who, like the Socinians, deny his divinity. the law of those, however, who have been born outside the church and who are ignorant of the Lord because they do not have the word, will be seen in the pages that follow. 84. That the ancient peoples had an idea of the divine as human is confirmed from the manifestations of the divine to Abraham, Lot, Joshua, Gideon, Manoah and his wife, and others. They saw God as a man, but yet adored him as the God of the universe, calling him the God of heaven and earth, and Jehovah. That it was the Lord who was seen by Abraham, he himself teaches in John 8:56, and that it was he who was seen by the others is evident from the Lord's words. No man hath seen God at any time, the only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father. He hath declared him. John 1:18, which hath sent me, hath borne witness of me. Ye have neither heard his voice at any time, nor seen his shape. John 5:37. 85. But that God is man can scarcely be comprehended by those who judge all things from the sense experiences of the external man. For the sensual man can think of the divine only from the world and the things that are therein, thus of a divine and spiritual man in the same way as of a corporeal and natural man. From this he concludes that, if God were a man he would be as large as the universe, and if he ruled heaven and earth it would be done through many, after the manner of kings in the world. If told that in heaven there is no extension of space as in the world, he would not in the least comprehend. For he who thinks from nature and its light only, never thinks otherwise than from an extension such as there is before his eyes. But they are completely deceived when they think in this way about heaven. The extension there is not like extension in the world. In the world, extension is determinate and thus measurable, but in heaven it is not determinate and therefore not measurable. What, however, extension in heaven is, will be seen in the pages to follow in connection with space and time in the spiritual world. Besides, everyone knows how far the sight of the eye extends, namely, to the sun and stars which are so remote. Whoever thinks more deeply knows that the internal sight, which is that of thought, has a still wider extension and therefore that a still more interior sight must extend even more widely. What, then, must not the divine sight be which is the inmost and highest of all? Because thoughts are capable of such extension, all things of heaven are communicated with everyone there. So too are all things of the divine which makes heaven and fills it, as has been shown in the preceding sections. 86. Those in heaven were amazed that men believed themselves intelligent, who, in thinking of God, think of something invisible, that is, incomprehensible under any form, and that they call those who think differently unintelligent and simple, when yet the reverse is the case. They say if those who thus believe themselves to be intelligent were to examine themselves, would they not see nature as God's sum, nature as it is before their eyes, others, the invisible side of nature? And further, are they not so blind that they know not what God is, what an angel is, or a spirit, or their soul which is to live after death, what the life of heaven with man, and many other things that are matters of intelligence. Yet those they call simple know all these things in their way, having an idea of their God that he is the divine in a human form, of an angel that he is a heavenly man, of their soul that it is to live after death, that it is like an angel, and of the life of heaven with man that it is to live in accordance with the divine precepts. These are the ones whom angels call intelligent and fitted for heaven, but the others, on the contrary, not intelligent. To collected extracts from the Arcana Caelestia relating to the Lord and his divine human. The Lord had the divine from his very conception. The Lord alone had a divine seed. His soul was Jehovah. Thus the Lord's inmost was the divine itself, while the clothing was from the mother. The divine itself was the being esse of the Lord's life, and from this the human afterwards went forth and became the existing existere from that being esse. 3. Within the Church where the Word is, and by it the Lord is known, the Lord's divine ought not to be denied, nor the holy that goes forth from him. Those within the Church who do not acknowledge the Lord have no conjunction with the divine, but it is otherwise with those outside the Church. The essential of the Church is to acknowledge the Lord's divine and his union with the Father. For the glorification of the Lord is treated of in the Word in many passages, and in the internal sense of the word everywhere. The Lord glorified his human, but not the divine, since this in itself was glorified. The Lord came into the world to glorify his human. The Lord glorified his human by means of the divine love that was in him from conception. The Lord's love towards the entire human race was his life in the world. The Lord's love transcends all human understanding. The Lord saved the human race by glorifying his human. Otherwise the whole human race world have perished in eternal death. The state of the Lord's glorification and humiliation. Glorification in respect of the Lord is the uniting of his human with the divine, and to glorify is to make divine. When the Lord glorified his human he put off everything human that was from the mother, until at last he was not her son. 5. The Son of God from eternity was the divine truth in heaven. When the Lord was in the world he also made his human, divine truth from the divine good that was in him. The Lord then arranged all things in himself apud southeast into a heavenly form, which is in accord with divine truth. For this reason the Lord was called the Word, which is divine truth. The Lord alone had perception and thought from himself, and above all angelic perception and thought. The divine truth which was himself, the Lord united with divine good which was in him. The union was reciprocal. 6. In passing out of the world the Lord also made his human divine good. This is what is meant by his coming forth from the Father and returning to the Father. Thus he became one with the Father. Since the union divine truth goes forth from the Lord. How divine truth goes forth, illustrated. It was from his own power that the Lord united the human with the divine. It can be confirmed from this that the Lord's human was not like the human of another man, because it had been conceived from the divine itself. His union with the Father, from whom was his soul, was not as between two persons, but as between soul and body. 7. The most ancient people could not worship the divine being Esse, but could worship only the divine existing existere, which is the divine human. Therefore the Lord came into the world in order to become the divine existere from the divine Esse. The ancients acknowledged the divine because he appeared to them in a human form, and this was the divine human. The infinite being Esse could flow into heaven with the angels and with man only by means of the divine human. In heaven no other divine than the divine human is perceived. The divine human from eternity was the divine truth in heaven and the divine passing through heaven. Thus it was the divine existing existere which afterwards in the Lord became the divine being Esse per southeast, from which is the divine existere in heaven. What the state of heaven was before the Lord's coming. The divine was not perceptible except when it passed through heaven. 8. The inhabitants of all the earths worship the divine under a human form, that is, the Lord. They rejoice when they hear that God actually became man. The Lord receives all who are in good and who worship the divine under a human form. God cannot be thought of except in human form, and what is incomprehensible does not fall into any idea, so neither into belief. Man is able to worship that of which he has some idea, but not that of which he has no idea. Therefore the divine is worshipped under a human form by most of the inhabitants of the entire globe, and this is the effect of influx from heaven. All who are in good in regard to their life, when they think of the Lord, think of the divine human, and not of the human separate from the divine. It is otherwise with those who are not in good in regard to their life. In the Church at this day those who are in evil in regard to their life, and those who are in faith separate from charity, think of the human of the Lord apart from the divine, and do not even comprehend what the divine human is. Why they do not? The Lord's human is divine because it is from the being Esse of the Father, and this was his soul illustrated by a father's likeness in children. Also because it was from the divine love, which was the very being Esse of his life from conception. Every man is such as his love is, and is his love. The Lord made all his human, both internal and external, divine. Therefore, differently from any man, he rose again as to his whole body. 9. That the Lord's human is divine is acknowledged from his omnipresence in the Holy Supper. Also from his transfiguration before his 3 disciples. Also from the word of the Old Testament, in that he is called God and 10,154 and is Jehovah. In the sense of the letter, a distinction is made between the Father and the Son, that is, between Jehovah and the Lord, but not in the internal sense of the word, in which the angels of heaven are. In the Christian world the Lord's human has been declared not to be divine. This was done in a council for the Pope's sake. that he might be acknowledged as the Lord's vicar. 10 Christians were examined in the other life in regard to their idea of one God, and it was found they held an idea of three gods. A divine trinity or trine in one person, thus one God, is conceivable, but not a trinity in three persons. A divine trine in the Lord is acknowledged in heaven. The trine in the Lord is the divine itself, called the Father, the divine human, which is the Son, and the divine going forth, which is the Holy Spirit, and this divine trine is a one. The Lord himself teaches that the Father and he are one, also that the Holy Divine goes forth from him and is his. 11. The divine human flows into heaven and makes heaven. The Lord is the all in heaven and is the life of heaven. The Lord dwells in what is his own with the angels. Consequently, those who are in heaven are in the Lord. The Lord's conjunction with angels is in accordance with their reception of the good of law and charity from him. The entire heaven has reference to the Lord. The Lord is the common center of heaven. All in heaven turn themselves to the Lord, who is above the heavens. Nevertheless, angels do not turn themselves to the Lord, but the Lord turns them to himself. It is not the presence of angels with the Lord, but the Lord's presence with angels. In heaven there is no conjunction with the divine itself, but conjunction with the divine human. 12. Heaven corresponds to the divine human of the Lord. Consequently, heaven in general is as a single man, and for this reason heaven is called the grand man. The Lord is the only man, and those only are men who receive the divine from him. So far as they receive are they men and images of him. Therefore angels are forms of law and charity in human form, and this from the Lord. 13. The entire heaven is the Lord's. He has all power in the heavens and on earth. As the Lord rules the whole heaven, he also rules all things depending thereon, thus all things in the world. The Lord alone has the power to remove the hells, to withhold from evils, and to hold in good, thus to save. Next, I will post an article that says, there is a correspondence of all things of heaven with all things of man. Thank you.